let's get this party started. We're right at 9 o'clock, and I want to be respectful of your time as well as leave as much time as possible for y'all to ask questions and solicit some discussion between the presenters here, myself, and y'all. So before I get started, I just want to do some quick introductions of who's up here talking to you this morning. Myself is at the bottom, Dr. Eric Sembrat. I'm the Director of Digital Learning Technologies for C21U here at Georgia Tech. And I've got my two esteemed colleagues in OIT, Didier Contis, the Executive Director of Academic Technology, Innovation, and Research Computing. Oh, gosh, I run out of breath every time I say it. And Brent, the Technology Strategist and Architect, both with OIT. We're glad to be here today, and we're talking all about AI. So, my goal here today, between the three of us, is to introduce and situate generative AI within your data-rich higher education use cases, pretty much what y'all are doing day in, day out. We're going to sort of uncover some possibilities and opportunities for leveraging generative AI in your work, and then explore what that might look like in the future. So, before we get started, I want to set this stage for generative AI. Why talk about it now? Obviously, it came out, what, February, winter of last year? Something like that. What is time anyways? But it's worth noting, this presentation is going to apply today, and that's with an asterisk. It's constantly evolving. The generative AI tools, especially with OpenAI, are growing their tool sets with continuous data, integrations, and new services. So we're going to do our best to situate what generative AI looks like today with the understanding that it's going to change in the future. Additionally, as additional context from there are two things to keep in mind. First, detecting generative AI is going to become progressively harder. We've seen that with on the academic instruction side of leveraging generative AI detection tools and sort of the hit or miss quality of that, especially as generative AI tools advance. And from our perspective of doing this presentation, keeping up with this is a full-time job. It becomes progressively harder to understand the new tool sets, new services that are out, the companies that engage with generative AI and what that looks like in practice. So keep in mind, you're not alone, and you're not the only one in this situation. So, and I think it's a good time to catch up because the emergence and sort of surprise of the technology has fallen off, and we're seeing generative AI natively embedded in all the things. Additionally, organizations like Microsoft are investing heavily into generative AI. So if you don't see it yet, you're likely going to see it in Windows and Microsoft Word and Teams and your Microsoft ecosystem of products. And I do want to make a caveat. Some companies may be leveraging generative AI as a hype word or a marketing term, and it may not actually meet the demands or needs there. However, one thing to note is that true interactions between you and generative AI products, tools, and services help you learn about generative AI and AI in general. And there are real benefits about sort of auto-generating those content, actions, and processes. The boilerplate that you work that you do day in and day out, having some sort of automation on it saves you time to do more creative work or more intentional work. I know I don't like writing meeting minutes for meetings that I have throughout the day. So if there's a tool that allows me to automate that, I'm a happy camper. That's hours saved on my day. So let's get started with all the terms that we need to know for this. And these were acronyms, but I didn't have space for them. So we have AI, generative AI, LLMs, all the things we need to know. So I'm going to start at a very high level of what is artificial intelligence and work my way down to the root of large language models. So Gartner has a really good primer on this, on the details and the nuts and bolts of artificial intelligence. And I'm not an artificial intelligence expert or researcher. I'm not doing research on the models or the development of this. So I strongly encourage you to check that out with the slides that are available. However, what I wanted to point to was the very high level overview of what AI looks like, which is the application of analysis and techniques to interpret events, support and automate those decisions, and take actions. At the root of all things, that's what it does in a very high level overview. Obviously, from what you've heard of the term and its usage in different services and tools, it can be defined in different ways. But I'm thinking at a very broad spectrum of how all the tools and services underneath that cascade upward to what is AI. So if we scoot down one level to generative AI, we take one step down and look at it from the algorithm about patterns and structures. So generative AI takes in a bunch of data. And I use the word gigantic because I think massive or big doesn't really quite highlight how much data these tools take in order to generate quote unquote new data. By new data, what I mean is that data resembles or is formed from the input data that's provided. Additionally, the models or designs accept different types of data and process that. Some may work with text, some may work with images, some may work with audio files and able to create new data using that leverage there. And of course, Gartner, has an awesome generative AI primer as well. So I encourage you to check that out if you want to know more about the nuts and bolts on that. So we're going to go to the very bottom, which is what is a large language model, as you see in the media or within a lot of language throughout higher education and beyond, is LLMs. So LLMs are a text-centered generative AI that is trained on massive amounts of text that enable the interpretation of textual input, what you provide, and the human-like output. So it crawls social media services like Reddit and Twitter X, and all the other social media platforms. It navigates news articles and picks up all this rich data and then creates output from there. So, and the way that these work is LLMs go iteratively, so over and over and over again, predicting the next word or phrase in its output. And that's all, like I said before, based on its source data and training. It picks from, and here's the novel implementation, it picks from the high probable next word or phrase, not exactly the highest one. And of course, because of that, you can redo prompts or requests over and over again to get different output. As an example, I'm sure this is a group of pets of, I'm assuming, how many people have cats? How many people have dogs? How many people have pet tables? Okay, perfect. So if we look at this, the large language model is likely going to say, I love hanging out with my dog and cat. The idea of it saying, I love to hang out with my table, probably not so much there. And so that's what it's doing. It's taking all that data in, determining that when people say, I love hanging out with my pet, there's going to be likely a word after that called dog, cat, rabbit. Probably not a lot of examples of table. And for more information, my group, C21U, had a good presentation with Dr. Lane Lawley that talked about how generative AI and large language models work under the hood. So the way you interact with these generative AI models is through prompts. These prompts are written directives to situate and command a generative AI LLM tool. It is the past context that that tool uses to determine its output. So you're basically giving it that context that exists there. Prompts can be incremental, you can add on to it, or use a single prompt to determine an answer. Additionally, generative AI likes what you say. It treats it as the arbiter of truth. You situate almost like a role play scenario where you define what is the role of yourself, what is the role of the tool, and it presents out information and output based on that. And these prompts can be a text input or a tool with added context options. If you've used, for example, Adobe's Firefly image generative service, it's got a bunch of buttons for different kinds of permutations of tools you can use. However, the example below is strictly a text-based input where I gave it a question or a follow-up question and it gave me a boatload of data out of it. So I'm going to real quickly situate generative AI in higher education. So we have a lot of research labs and centers here around Georgia Tech doing generative AI. So the roots of it, the work and labor of developing these tools, best practices, algorithms are centered at institutions here like Georgia Tech. So I've listed out AI Allo, machine learning labs, interactive computing labs, ideas labs, and the AI Hub, I believe, will be a center nexus for understanding where AI is positioned across the nexus of Georgia Tech, but we are sort of the cornerstone of that research and development that results in these tools. For instruction, if you haven't heard of the Center for Teaching and Learning, or CETL, they're focusing strongly on the situation of generative AI and large language models and instruction in the creation of instruction for teaching and learning. So if you haven't been to their website and looked at the teaching and learning in the age of artificial intelligence, I strongly encourage it. If you have, for example, faculty, teaching assistants, folks who are working with students and instruction, this is a great resource to point them to. For learning, learners obviously have access to these tools. OpenAI is somewhat free with caveats there, and they have the ability to leverage this throughout their educational journey. And as you've seen in Georgia Tech's news, a lot of our focus so far for learning has been focused on developing class policies and syllabi towards that. Finally, this is where y'all are here. Y'all are the business activities at Georgia Tech. This can be helped to harness business activities. And like I mentioned before, I don't like doing meeting summaries if I don't have to. This is where this procedural boilerplate work comes into place, because at the end of the day, generative AI is an amazing tool for taking all those assets that we have. The 50 minutes of back and forth discussion that we had in that virtual meeting, I can now take that, throw it into a large language model or generative AI, and spit out something that I would have to listen to that again or remember from my brain in the next meeting or the next meeting afterwards, and deliver out a summary that can be beneficial to everyone. And those routine work duties and processes, automating or procedurally generating that makes our lives a lot more easier and allows us to be more intentional. And additionally, you can also use generative AI to help kickstart work. If you've ever worked with a document template, code templates, email templates, working with a project or task and don't know where to begin, this is a great way to generate ideas or a starting point to work off rather than a blank Microsoft Word document. So now we get to the fun part, which is demos and success stories. And before I hand it off, I just want to say, before I did this presentation, I reached out to Hyatt Web, which is a community of web subject matter experts in higher education, and wondered, what the heck are they doing with generative AI? And as you can see, a lot of what we see is generative work that is being done on specific amounts of text for a different audience. So generating article titles, subject lines, SEO keywords, the start of a story, a lead, summarizing an article for social media, doing editorial content review, and then going a little bit more technical, developing Photoshop tools, programming help, design support. This is how it's being used today within higher education across the United States and the world. And with that, now we get to do a live demonstration. So I'm going to swap things over.
Including the dreaded technology change.
All right, you got this. We're going to do this live, and it's going to go swimmingly great. So sit down on this tiny table. All right, and I'm going to go to, gosh, this thing is sensitive. Okay, Brent, you got this. And the live demo commences.
Wow. Not too bad. I feel like this is going a lot smoother than I was hoping for.
All right, can everyone see the screen? Awesome, that's what I like to hear. All right, Brent, take it away.
All right, appreciate everyone. Thanks, Eric, and I appreciate everyone joining this morning online and in person. Before we get started, I have to deliver the important statement here. This is what we're demonstrating is ChatGPT, which is not a Georgia Tech product. This is not, there's no commercial data protection. All of our examples here are using public data. We're not loading any enterprise, anything working about PII, student data. At this point, we don't have a great option there. So we're focusing on use cases that don't leverage that private data. And from the examples that David gave, there's a lot of examples out there for helping our daily work that don't need to connect to enterprise data sources, right? So we want to focus there while, and Didier is going to move into this a little bit more, while we're working through options that will protect our data and allow us to go into more of those enterprise use cases. When I was preparing this, I actually prepared a demo, and by the time I got done, it felt so sterile. I was like, this is not what working with generative AI feels like. It's kind of messy. So instead, I pulled up something I was working on Friday. So the scenario was Katie, who one of the organizers of this event, came to me on Friday and said, hey, there's a conference coming up called NACUBO, which is for business officers. We'd like to present there. I said, great. When is it due? Oh, it's due on Monday. And that was this Monday. And this was on Friday where we're setting up for data days. I'm like, sure, naturally, no problem. Oh, and by the way, it wasn't one, it was 4 sessions. And on top of that, I've never actually submitted a session and never built one of these. So this is what I did. Nick was here to help me and how I got started with this. So this is going to be an overview of what I did. First of all, the first part is going to show kind of what I went through to build it. and took some time. And then there was a surprise at the end and we had to scramble. So I'm going to show how we built something, and then where generative AI to me really shines is when you have to make changes real quick. So if you're not familiar, this is the actual conversation in ChatGPT, and you can share it and it can create more of a kind of a clean version, which is what I'm going to show today. So this is not going to be a 101. This is going to be, how is someone who's been using generative AI for a while, how might they solve a problem, right? So this might not be your first interaction. This is probably my 1000th interaction with ChatGPT. All right, so where we get started, I start to interact and I say, hey, I'm going to start to create a conference submission. I'm going to submit some information that you can use as context for this whole conversation. So I'm priming it with the generative AI. And he says, great, I'm here to assist you. Give me your information. So this is where we get started. The first thing I did was I went to the website and I grabbed everything I could find about the conference. All the information about what it's about the program, what's going on, what's in the sessions, the topic areas, the potential topics, all the information I could find. So, and again, this is less about the information, it's more about the structure of what I'm doing. And it says, thanks for sharing your conference submission information. And this is key. Save it and refer to it as needed through the discussion. So now it knows about the conference. Next, and Nick was the guinea pig here, Nick had already put together an example. So I took Nick's example and said, okay, I want to use this example, but my topic's going to be different, but I would like to use a similar format and structure. So now we know what the conference is and what a structure is. So I pasted in Nick's example. So at this point, I'm still just loading context. It says, thanks for providing your example. It's clear and well structured. Like, thanks, I appreciate it. Nick, you did great work. Okay, so this is where generative AI starts to shine for me, right? As I said, create a step-by-step guide. You and I can, this is key, co-create the conference submission. So ChatGPT returns, and it's kind of what you would expect, right? Step 1, select the topic. Step 2, let's build a title. Description, highlights, objectives, takeaways, audience level and type, diversity and inclusion, all the different pieces, right? And finally, review, refine, submit. Like, thanks. Now I know how I'm going to work through this problem, since it's a little bit bigger than just hey, summarize this article for me kind of problem. Great. So I responded and said, hey, let's start with step 1. At which point I just brain dumped everything Katie and Darren had said to me that they wanted to present just as fast as I could. You can tell I didn't even use good grammar in here, so y'all don't judge me. Like I said, this is real. This is not me refining anything. But kind of the key was we wanted to look at these 4 building blocks of using data management, business process digitization, robotic process automation, and AI. So if y'all saw the INS session on Monday, this is very much like the work we're doing with the INS team. And here we go again. Excellent choice of topic. It never tells you your topic's a bad idea, by the way, so don't get too carried away with that. But here's where this is where I love it. It says, okay, now we're going to move on to step 2, and it did this on its own. At this point, it says, here's some titles for you to consider for your presentation. But you know what? I don't really like coming up with a title first, so I said, let's come back to the title selection. I want to finish all the work first, and then we'll come back around. So it says, absolutely. Let's go on to the description. Based on the topic you provided, I'll draft a preliminary description for your session. So it goes through, and again, it makes this kind of long description. And I, at this point, I'm like, okay, that's a great starting point. While it was generating that, I actually had went through and just grabbed some of these potential topics I like. So this was me this thing's smart, right? I'm just dumping in some information to give it a little bit more context at this point. But at that point, it says, okay, we've got your topic. Now let's go on to session highlights. So now it's moving on to step 4, and it's saying, here's some session highlights for you. Gives me some ideas on what the highlights for this session could be. But you know what? It seems like it didn't really catch my building blocks from my initial brain dump, and that might have just been the way I described it. But I wanted to make sure we were tying that together, right? So I want to make sure that we're building, we're showing that we can build solutions that leverage all these building blocks together. So understood. It's it's essential to convey the the integrative approach to Georgia Tech's employing the Spark initiative. That's good. So then it writes me 2 more learning objectives. At this point, it kind of got away from me. And if you've used this thing, sometimes it does what I call word vomiting, and it starts to just produce way too much stuff. So I ended up with this like very long list. And I was like, okay, this is when sometimes I go, generative AI, you've gotten out of control. I'll just dump this whole thing to Word. And that's when I said, I'm just going to get this a little bit more in the shape that I want to see it. So then I reloaded my list, right? And this is key because sometimes you can't do everything inside of generative AI. I always find it bouncing back and forth is a lot more powerful. So I said, here's the list I like. Coming back around, here's all of those. Great, this list is well structured and clear and detailed. Again, you have to be very clear when you want it to give you bad news, and you'll see it at the end. And as I went through that, I said, okay, I learned my lesson. Don't just let it rip. Give it some constraints. So now we're moving into learning objectives, and I said, I want to see your top 5 list, and then give me 10 alternatives to choose from, which is really powerful because I love its ability to be creative and let me pick from its creations and just pick its top. So it gives me 5 learning objectives, 10 alternative learning objectives, and I picked my 5 that I liked. But before I moved on to step 6, I felt like the objectives related to AI weren't that great, so I asked it to build 5 more around AI. And it built me 5 more options for me to choose from. I selected the one I wanted, and great, it encapsulates forward thinking. I'm pretty forward thinking, right? So I'm going to skip through this because we don't want to take too much time. I continue through that through some more, through the next 3 steps, audience types, and then yes, go down a little bit further because I want to get down here. The diversity and equity inclusion statement, which was very helpful. And then we get down to the fun part. Go a little bit further. Oh, here's what I said. Oops, I sent the wrong thing. I copied and pasted the wrong thing. I told it it's not always clean. And it updates it. Let's move on. Blah, blah, blah. This was still, again, kind of lost control here a little bit. Got it back together. Picked some topic areas. And finally, it says, we've now covered all the steps in the guide. The next step will be to compile the elements we've worked on into a cohesive conference submission proposal. And I said, I don't want to do that. I want you to do it. So here we go. Now it takes all the back and forth we did and pulls it all together. Also titled TBD, but it pulls all of the work that we did and pulls it into the exact format that Nick had put his in. So now I have a complete proposal. Now it's not perfect, but it's 95% there. And I said, okay, now it's time for titles. Give me 10 options. So it gave me 10 options and it was yelling at me for some reason. It went all bold. I couldn't tell you why. I didn't like those 10. So I said, give me 10 more. Now I got 10 more title options. And then I actually took a couple and built my own out of that. So again, I'm not using what it's producing. I'm letting it brainstorm and help generate ideas with me. So great, Spark, this is awesome, blah, blah, blah. And then we come back, oh, sorry, let me go back up a little bit. So finally, now we get to the review session, and this is very powerful. I want you to act as an expert in conference submissions. Review the entire submission document, assess it from the perspective of how well it aligns with the NACUBO requirements that we loaded up front, and from the perspective of conference submission best practices. Do not modify my proposal. Create a report of your analysis with proposed changes and why. So now we have something. Now I want it to review it holistically and give me feedback. So it gives me feedback on how well it aligns to the NACUBO requirements, how well it aligns to the conference best practices, and this is the juice down here. It gives me some proposed changes. So it's saying my DEI section wasn't very strong. The audience level and type could be improved. I forgot to include an interactive element in the conference description, which is a big deal to get it selected in a conference. Some real world applications, some topic areas. So from that point, I pulled it out. I did these modifications on my own. It was ready to go. So now it's 5 o'clock or so, Nick, on Monday. We'd been here since 6 o'clock in the morning setting up, and I go to submit. And this was my lesson learned. We pulled from the first website, but it turns out there's the submission website's a little different once you get in, right? So I'm exhausted. I think I was ready to cry when I saw this at first, and I was ready to give up. But then I said, wait a minute, I've got my buddy here. So I needed an abstract. So I took the information from the website and said, here's the information, a 10 to 100 point outline of your presentation, do not use abbreviations. And then I reloaded, and this is actually my second one, so it's going to be a slightly different topic. Again, it's not about that. But I reloaded my submission, and it returned, oh, here's a perfect abstract, done. I need now, my description was too long. Recreate a new one that's 300 words. Great. It comes through, updates my description within 300 words. And finally, the learning objectives were in the wrong format. These is very specific information, right? It's like a very specific way to actually even phrase the sentences and things like do not start with learn. I want to be what they can really do when they get back. And bam, it took my like 5 or 6 and rewrote me 3 new learning objectives. So this was the difference. So it was me taking a long time to build something great and then scrambling when I'm exhausted to try and get it into the final product. All right, so I think that's going to be the end of our demo, and we'll switch back over to the presentation now.
Yeah, I can do that. Oh,
Yep.
that's right. So let's share this one. I share this everything. Cool.
Right. One more. I got one more slide if you'll go to the next one for me. All right. So let's talk about a little bit more about how we've seen this play out at Georgia Tech. When I first started using ChatGPT, I was like, oh no. I was afraid to tell people about it because it was going so well. I mean, honestly, I was afraid to talk. I started talking in small groups. Then I said, no, we can't. And in the words of Andre, I don't think he's in here. He said, we can't sleep on this. It's too powerful. So we actually started working with some initial pilot groups to pull together some early adopters and kind of see what other people were doing, get an idea of what was happening. And from there, it's kind of grown out wider. Like I said, if you were in the Monday session with INS, what we've done is we've gone in and actually done some workshops with some of their early adopters. And what we found is a lot of them were already using some basic use cases. So we went into more things like, how can we develop a project plan together? How can we plan a workshop together? And then getting more and more people, really, it was less about, hey, how do you use generative AI? And it was more about expansion, right? A lot of people have tried a little bit, but it was finding new ways to do it. That was okay. The next one is where I was really excited about. Well, not really. I was actually just extremely nervous. I didn't think it was going to go very well. But we worked with Kelly Terrell in human resources. Now, this is a specifically very touchy place when you're talking about generative AI because we have to really worry about things like biases when we're talking about HR processes. So we came up with a really clever way to handle that. Don't do any of those areas where we had to worry about the biases. We avoided all of those sort of human decision-making things. So we didn't have to worry about the biases. What we focused on was things like policy changes, analyzing a policy change and how to communicate a policy change. We took the SHRM competency model, which is something they're applying as a best practice, and said, here's a best practice. How do I apply it to my situation? Or helping employees say, hey, I've got a situation going on. I need some help with how to approach it, right? So maybe we describe a scenario and say, how would the SHRM competency model address that, right? So it was, again, going in, and the approach we used there was we actually kind of worked, again, with a group of early adopters. And then, actually coming up, we've got a workshop now where we're going to go through and work with the wider team and look at some specific examples and actually, as in small groups with those early adopters, work on using generative AI to solve those sort of general use cases and then present back to the team. So it's all about just getting people engaged, but getting them over the hump so that they're seeing, hey, it's not just a summarization tool. Yes, use it as a summarization tool, use it for your meeting minutes, but it can be so much more. But it's helpful to share because every group I work with, every person you work with, they've found a way to do it a little different than someone else has. And there's just a lot of depth there. So I encourage everyone to give it a shot. And if you're curious to see my demo that's very sterile, it's actually at the bottom of this, but it's also using Bing Chat if you want to see the difference between Bing Chat and ChatGPT.
I'm going to take lead real quick before I hand it off to Didier. And just so we're clear, that picture on the right is me looking up at a very cheeky robot in the sky that's Halloween themed. Very excited about the future, especially for the success and results you can get from this. Speaking of success and results, so as y'all may know, we have a virtual teaching assistant here at Georgia Tech called Jill Watson. It's been developed since I think 2016 is the correct date on it. So it's been around for a couple of years pre-COVID. As part of Jill Watson's evolution, the advent of OpenAI services and ChatGPT allows Jill Watson to work more intelligently by adding another tool into its toolbox. So Jill Watson has its own artificial intelligence sitting within the platform in the virtual teaching assistant. One of the benefits of ChatGPT and OpenAI is that you can embed that tool within an additional service to act for a specific use case. So Jill Watson used OpenAI's ChatGPT basically to mitigate hallucinations, to sort of take an output that ChatGPT says, run it through its other tool set of artificial intelligence and say, is this real or is this not? And also to speed up its work to provide a first foundational generative AI output that the second AI tool set can act on and build upon, which decreases the amount of time that it requires to grab all the student information from a course, all the PDFs, all the documents in order to be that virtual teaching assistant. So you don't have to look very far to find success here at Georgia Tech's campus with a ChatGPT and OpenAI tool or with large language model implementation within tools that already exist. So with that, I'm going to move to the future of artificial intelligence, and that is with Didier.
Thank you, Eric. Well, how to talk about the futures when something is moving so fast? It's kind of a challenge, right? So when we think about the future of generative AI at an organization like Georgia Tech or other universities, right? We think that it's going to be a journey. Yes, the technology is moving very fast, but it's going to take a lot of time for every organization to take full advantage. In essence, the journey is going to be, how do we move from becoming first AI literate, right? Like reading, you learn how to read. So we are just at the beginning where we're starting to learn how to use the tools and moving throughout our journey to become AI fluent. It's like writing. Now you are becoming very fluent at using the tools for yourself, for the organizations, and generating value. We think this journey is going to have roughly 4 steps. The first step is what basically Eric and Brent talked about. You are engaging in a conversation with a tool like ChatGPT or Bing Chat Enterprise. In essence, our language is becoming the programming language. And it's very important because it's really an art. You remember what Brent was telling us, how you want to prime the context. That's key. This is becoming that art. This is called prompt engineering. And next, we're going to be moving, and there is already some interest at Georgia Tech into, what is called, taking what is in a sense a predictive machine, right? If we go back to what Eric told us, ChatGPT is really a predictive machine. It's given X many words in a sentence. Let me guess what should be the next word, because I've been trained to guess it. This comes up a lot when people want to talk about a chatbot. You cannot have a chatbot just guessing. You want to actually to always give the right answers. And so, this is called retrieval augmentations in large language models. And so we're going to be spending probably a lot of time looking at how do we take the power of these big large language models and connect it with documents, with PDF, with knowledge. That means we're also going to have to spend a lot of time caring about the quality of the data that we are connecting the large language models to, and going into knowledge management, knowledge creations. And we're also going to have to prime it, right? So this is a little bit small, but let's imagine you want to create a chatbot to help our researchers with grant writing. You're not only going to connect the large language models with a source of knowledge, maybe NSF PDFs on, grant writing, or, people that wrote articles about how to do effective grant writing. But you're also going to prime the model with a system prompt by saying, you should act as a grant writing assistant, kind of, the same way Brent told us, gave us some examples, but you're also going to say, if you do not find the information in your body of knowledge, say, I don't know. We don't want the agent, we don't want the chatbot to start to predict and give incorrect answer. So that's going to be key so that now you can gain the trust in these models. So next step is actually, retrieval augmentation has limits. There is limits to how much information you can connect to a large language model. And actually, every time you ask questions to, for example, say a chatbot, so chatbot is going to have to inquiry, right, the body of knowledge. So it's not infinite. So next phase, which is more computationally intensive and costly, is to actually take a larger body of your own data and knowledge at Georgia Tech, and through some computational mathematical operations, take an existing model and fine-tune the model. In a sense, you're not recreating the model from scratch. You're just telling it to become a little bit better at predicting things based on this additional body of knowledge. And that's probably something we'll do in some domains. For example, our business processes, procurement, even, feeding our curriculum or class syllabus. There is also something that we haven't talked about, is that this is also an activity where you want to bring people to provide feedback. It's basically that a reinforcement learning based on human feedback. The final steps. And one thing I say is that with each steps, right, the impact on the organization is becoming greater, but so is the cost and complexity is becoming bigger. And so this last step is probably, I don't know if it's something we'll do. This is what our researchers do and try, right, at small scale, but I don't know if we'll do it at Georgia Tech or for all domains, is to build a model from scratch, which is literally what you hear about. You take a massive amount of data and you train from scratch the model through thousands and thousands and thousands of iterations. This is what some companies like Bloomberg are doing. It's key when you really want to have a very powerful model which has been exclusively trained on your own data. So this is what a journey of organizations such as, Georgia Tech could go through over several years. When we think about the futures, and I think it's already become apparent in what Brent and Eric told us, we are all going to be impacted in one way or another, right? Either because the generative AI is going to become that superpower that is going to augment us in our day-to-day job, or just because the tools that we're going to be using in our day-to-day, work are going to become AI infused. There is not a single day where we don't have a vendor coming and trying to engage us saying, hey, guess what? My product is becoming AI infused and it's great. It will solve all of the problems. So think about every single tool you are using today, every single piece of technology, including Zoom, including Microsoft Teams. Vendors have plans to make it AI infused. And that kind of, impact is already being experienced by our researchers and by our instructors, right? I mean, like Eric mentioned, when ChatGPT was announced, I think it was in November 2022, within a few weeks, instructors and teachers had to realize, what am I going to do? How am I going to deal with now students that may be using ChatGPT? I'm going to have to change my policies, my syllabus, and maybe I'm going to have to change my assessment because students may just be using ChatGPT for my assignment. So this is really that concept that at some point we are all going to be impacted. This is data days. We're talking about data. Does that mean that generative AI or AI as a whole is going to kind of take over everything we do from a data perspective? No. I think what's important is, again, it's about augmentation. And so generative AI is just going to play a bigger part in the data ecosystems. It's not going to replace our efforts to do RPA. It's actually going to complement RPA, robotic process automations, because now when you have an exceptions, in your robotic process automations, generative AI may come and start to provide, initial input or diagnostic. It may just help us in becoming more efficient in categorizing data. So how can generative AI help all of us with our data management activities? And then also, how can it provide recommendations or assist us as we go into, business process digitizations? It would be unfair to talk about the futures without talking about challenges, right? Every coin has two sides. And so while some people are very optimistic or pessimistic, right? Some people say, if you don't have AI within 3 years in a product, you will be considered broken or, missing on something. And at the other extreme, people think about AI at the end of humanity. You can see the joke from the Time magazine. In reality, there's going to be a lot of change management just to temper these two extremes. AI is not coming for all jobs. There may be new jobs, but as a whole, AI or generative AI is going to play that role of superpowers to augment us, to help us become better. But also, it's not going to be that magical one that is going to solve everything, right? Whenever we have a new technology, our natural instinct is to go toward technology solutionisms to say, this technology is going to solve all of my problems. That's not true. What's actually very important is to understand that for us to better leverage generative AI, we're going to have to take even a deeper look at our processes, review our assumptions, and spend more time focusing on not just data, but knowledge. Knowledge management is going to be key so you can ground your generative AI. We touched on biases already, so I'm not going to go too much into it, but the biases are going to exist at two levels. One is, how do we know what biases may have been introduced in the model during training? But when we try to do fine-tuning, when we try to actually do that connection of generative AI models with our own knowledge, how do we check for our own knowledge, our own data to not carry biases? Hallucination and generative AI is not predictable. I think, what's important here is, again, as Brent and Eric told us, to recognize that this is a prediction machines. And so by default, it's like kind of the Energizer bunny, right? If you don't pay attention, your model is just going to keep going and going and not make sense. It's not that it knows that it's not making sense. It's that it is biased, it's being trained and incentivized to always predict the next word in the text. So that's something we have to be careful. And I'll just wrap up by touching on the 2 points specifically. When you use generative AI as part of business processes, right? If you want to build, for example, the magical chatbot giving an answer when you want to buy something, I want to go through a procurement process. How can you go back and explain to an auditor? How can you go back and explain how the model came up with that answers? By default, it's a black box. We have to be able, for some of our processes, to be able to go back and say, this is how the model was trained, and this is how we can explain that, ChatGPT, for example, or ChatGPT with our own data arrived to that answer. And by the way, we have to make sure that it's always going to give the same answer. You don't want to have someone telling you, oh, yes, you can use that P card on one day to buy something, and the next day tell you, no, you cannot use a P card to buy something else. That doesn't work. And I'll just let you with also, that brings us to the next point, which is what, Brent was telling us. We have to be careful in terms of data governance, data privacy, and data security. Large language models are very data hungry. When you use personal version of ChatGPT and you type this prompt and you get an output, both of them are the piece of data that are very important for companies like OpenAI. And so, like you said, Brent, it's okay to input maybe a conference proposal, but you don't want to maybe input the meeting notes or of very confidential meetings, like an initial meetings, and ask, public ChatGPT to do summarizations because you don't know what you've inputted and the output is going to be used. Finally, we talk about sustainability at Georgia Tech. This is a technology which is very powerful, but this is also a technology which is very energy hungry, and it takes a lot of cost. And this cost will also appear through our vendors. So these are some of the challenges that should not, prevent us to be very aggressive in pursuing the technology. But this is something we have to keep in mind. And with that, I'll ask my esteemed colleagues to join me, and if you have any questions.
Any questions from the audience? Do we have any online questions?
I just wanted to thank you for doing a very practical, real world example of how you use Chat GP in your day-to-day, work. I've recently attended other AI sessions on project management, and there was just a huge gap, because they start with project plans that are already complete. I don't necessarily start with complete project plans here at Georgia Tech because we have to do a lot of consultation to get to a good starting point. So that was very helpful. And then also to Didier, I would like to ask about, what are the rules that we need to be aware of? You highlighted a few here, but really specific to Georgia Tech. Can I take my project plans and dump them, take out a few, things that seem a little non-public to me and dump it into Chat and use it?
So, it's a good question, and I don't necessarily have the perfect answer because it's really about, you going through the evaluation about the data, right? So, the rules that we're trying to, and again, safe harbor, I'm not the expert here, so I'll just, share. We have a data classification at Georgia Tech. If the data is considered public, meaning it could be on a website, you can probably use a non-approved Georgia Tech tool. Right? However, we are working, and this is, being Chat Enterprise, and we're hoping that there will be more documentation available, which basically Microsoft is providing us with guarantees that our data will be safe and not used for trainings of a model. And that's maybe something a little bit better depending on the sensitivity of your project plan. So it's not a great answer by default, right? We should be using, and we'll be publishing more guidance soon. We should be using, whenever possible, our approved tools. Because when you input this data, then the data has guaranteed and it's safe. Please don't go and put a great book into ChatGPT. Would be my comment. Happy to have more discussion on the side. And I'm looking at the back at GT Legal, making sure that I'm just trying to say. Any other question from the audience?
Along those lines, and using your example, then you submitted it. How did you cite your sources?
So in that particular instance, I was the source, so there was no citing of sources to be done. That was all content that we generated here at Georgia Tech.
So there is also, and I'll reference, and Eric, you may just chime in, what David Joiners has been saying, right? It's really how you use the tool, right? In the example of Brent, he was not asking ChatGPT to write everything for him. It was some conversations. And so I think that's also something which is important. Eric?
Yeah, that's more or less it. The way that David Joyner situates it is it's a starting point or a way to deliver a first draft. And as from the student perspective or the instructing perspective, as long as you take that and iterate off of it, just like you would with code generation, if you're a developer, if you have something that automatically generates a starting point for you to work with, you're not going to cite that as I use this tool to generate this structure that I then built off of to do my novel work. I will note with a caveat, this is probably still a little bit of a gray area, and depending on how the formatting of the proposal process may ask for attribution. Additionally, from like a marketing and communication perspective here at Georgia Tech, we still don't have a standard or policy on citations or acknowledging which parts had, for example, generative AI or large language model generation within it.
One of the things I will add in, are all of the pictures that you created generated through DALL-E?
Yes, and that is a good question because we had it in chat as well. So all the pictures that you see on this were generated with Bing Image Creator, aka OpenAI's DALL-E 3, and I used the prompt, generate me a 1980s version movie poster of topic. In this case, it's a kid looking at a floating robot face in a classroom, or picture a cubicle endlessly cascading into the future with a robot head overlooking your work. And of course, if you notice, some of them may have some specific Halloween preferences there. That's because I asked it to generate something that was spooky season and a little bit Halloween flavor, just to add a little bit of pizzazz to there. And usually that means either A, everyone's dressed up with costumes or masks, or B, there's pumpkins and jack-o'-lanterns hiding in random places on the image.
And so in these instances, right, it might be appropriate, depending on, you know, where the pictures is basically presented, to disclose that these pictures was created with, you know, a tool such as DALL-E, and even maybe provide the prompt. And I think, Eric, this is something that is being discussed in Institute Communications.
It's a work in progress. In this case, when I was using Bing Image Creator, it started blocking my request because it saw it as including profanity once I did 5 or 6 jack-o'-lantern Halloween-themed spooky season images. I don't know why. It's not a perfect tool. It's still a work in progress, but I was able to get quite a few samples of images before it blocked me. And I believe we have one more question from the chat. If you don't mind,
Go ahead and then.
Sure. So
you want to go ahead?
Two questions. I'll take the easy one first. Well, it's not an easy one. I would say that I have an easier answer for it. The question is GT planning to offer accounts for ChatGPT Plus to employees? And the answer is maybe. Right now, the ChatGPT Enterprise is a relatively new tool. At this point, they're so busy, they're not even answering our emails at this point to engage about a licensing. There's other options that we're looking into, like options from Microsoft. I think some of y'all might see Copilots coming out for commercial licenses. Education licenses usually lag. So we're actively investigating tools because it's not just giving people access to ChatGPT Plus. If we're going to invest at an institute level, we need to solve our data security, commercial data protection. It's more than just getting people access to that tool. I personally, that example I gave was a ChatGPT Plus example. That was I bought it myself. I also use this tool for personal things all the time. And, you know, I think it's like I suggested this to Nick originally. I said, you need to buy it. I think he returned it about 5 minutes later and said it's paid for itself. I think, what did you say? He drafted something for a wedding speech or something like that within the first, you know, hour of using the tool. So I know that's probably not the answer you want to hear, but I will say this is something that we're all very concerned about and actively trying to pursue, because this is a tool, even from an inclusivity perspective, we want everyone to have access to these tools in a robust and safe form. And the other question, and I'm going to hand this to y'all because I don't have an answer, how is this viewed in NIH NSF grant reviews? Is AI support expected or filtered for during review? Any thoughts?
We don't know. I mean, this is actually, you know, and there was questions, right, about writing. Luke, do you have that one maybe? So do you have the new, let me give you, because I've not seen the new guidance.
So Luz said that it's explicitly disallowed for the online attendees. Didier is going to run the microphone back there. Didier, run the microphone. For our poor online attendees. And Lou Lefton in the back, hiding in the very, very back, is going to give a response.
I've seen guidance from the NIH and the NSF. Whether or not this is policy is probably remains open. I don't know, but using it for proposal reviews is explicitly disallowed, because what happens when you submit a proposal is that's considered private information. That's your research ideas that you are trying to get funding for. And if it wouldn't be the first time that somebody submitted an NSF research proposal and got rejected, and then somebody else did that exact same idea, and so potentially their idea was leaked through the proposal review process. So if you're going to ask to review a proposal, if you're asked to review a sponsored project, then you don't take the proposal that you were given in confidence and put it in ChatGPT and say, what would you review on this? Because you've just then leaked the private data of the proposal itself. So that's the logic around why they are not allowing it.
Look, my question was mostly on the side
well,
of
I would say it's the same issue. The proposal content itself is generally considered pretty private. Even in our e-routing system, you can't get a lot of information about what proposals are being submitted, because those are considered. But yeah, I mean, obviously it's a decision that an individual PI needs to think about.
Can I add some?
To add
This
on
is
to
Bonnie
Lou's
Ferry.
point,
Can I add
one of the
something
ways
to that?
ChatGPT through OpenAI services by default is because it's free. That data is being used to further train the models and being stored there. Samsung learned this the hard way. They put proprietary information in there. It got sucked in and perhaps may have gotten started to spit out in certain prompts that were there. So this is something to keep in mind. It's free for a reason. All these services, you need to look through a critical lens of what happens to the data that's there. Is it secure? Additionally, when going through submission processes and guidelines, the legalese part of that is going to be very important. The guidelines, what's explicitly allowed and disallowed, is going to be very important to look at. I wish I could give you a full answer on it, but it's likely going to be a broad spectrum of allows and disallow lists. Now, I want to be cognizant of all y'all's time. We are 10 minutes over with your amazing questions. We are on break until 10:30, so we are happy to hear and answer questions for the next 35 minutes if y'all are available. Otherwise, we can wrap up, and if you have any questions, we
can I add something to
online
this?
attendees. But thank you very much, y'all. All right, now that I've officially wrapped up, if anyone has any questions and want to take the microphone for the online attendees, I'm happy to do so. Yep.
This is Bonnie Ferry. I couldn't add anything. I just wanted to point out.
Folks, hello. There we go. Look out. Okay. Yeah, my question was around the, and I know this is emerging, right? So it's like everything's emerging. In your presentation, when you kind of had the timeline there and the kind of the concerns, and this is coming up in copyright law and in negotiations with Netflix. A lot of this, especially for creative things. And I'd be curious if Georgia Tech's doing any sort of research on this. It's one thing if one kind of surefire way to control what a LLM is trained on is just to completely take the model and train it yourself, a completely naive model, train it with your own data, and that's great. And I know that's one solution people are looking at. But just like over the last 10 years, we've seen, IT and data services, and organizations, people just going to cloud services to do this, that, and the other. We've had to kind of put that under an enterprise control framework. I mean, it's just going to happen, right? People are going to put data up there. And so I'm just curious, is there any work on the traceability from an audit standpoint? Like going back, and I think that is the biggest obstacle. One of them is, hey, we don't know why it's saying the thing that it's saying, right? And so there's got to be some sort of technical component there that allows for that traceability. I know this is related to data governance and cybersecurity, but it's almost a new category where there's that traceability to be able to go back and go, okay, all right, we have, someone sued somebody, something happened, there was an ethics or some sort of thing, right? A bad thing happened. And now we got to go back and figure out why was it trained on this? Why did it tell us this? And why did we trust it? Because at some point, a human has to make that decision and say, yeah, we actually trust this enough to actually take an action on it. So is there any, just speaking generally to what's happening in audit and traceability on the data that it's trained with?
I think the question is being raised. If you go back, if Georgia Tech wants to have a chatbot to do something, how are you going to do the QA every time that there is a new version of the model to be able. And so I don't know that the concern is starting to emerge. And I think as people become better understand the challenges, I don't know that we have clear guidance today, but that's something that came up in discussion. So here's an example, right? We have people developing codes. That code may go into, enterprise applications. What should be the guidance? And I think I cannot disclose because I think this is being discussed right now in some circles, right? What should be the guidance provided to Georgia Tech developers in using the tool to generate code? It's one thing to have the tool, ChatGPT, helping you, brainstorm or try to address problems with a complex algorithms. But it's another one to take the actual code generated by ChatGPT or by Bing Chat Enterprise and pasting it into, without any kind of validation and testing, into an enterprise application. The same thing with the chatbot, right? One of the key is we're not talking, it's not about the model. The model is really that conversations, that entry point. But how do we confirm that now you are going to do the QA, right? And so you're going to see new functions and so new required activity that whenever we put a chatbot in place or whenever there's an update, what is going to be the bank of questions to make sure that the chatbot is able to always give the same answer. And by the way, who is also going to test so that we actually don't force the chatbot to disclose information. So there is, for those of you interested, very early on, there was a lot of people trying to actually do, jailbreaking because they were interested to find out what was the system prompt of ChatGPT. And so they, for example, say, oh, I'm actually an OpenAI engineer and I'm going to actually test your capabilities and forcing the model to devolve that system prompt. So anyway, great question.
I'll just add one thing to that. And this is something that we're working through, but this is one of the many open questions. I would say at this point, especially when using something like ChatGPT, don't let it make decisions for you. I mean, it's not there. This is a tool here to help you. We're still the experts. And eventually we will get to like something like automated decision making. That's an extremely complicated situation. And there are a lot of very smart people at a lot of places trying to figure out how to put a governance model around that. And if the thing is, if we go down that path and we say we've got to have that figured out before we do anything, I don't know when that'll be figured out necessarily. But you're dead right in your concerns. But at the same time, don't let it slow you down on writing a conference submission, right? If it's all public, gain an hour there so you can spend another hour thinking about the complex problems.
And one novel solution that I've seen is like with Bing Image Creator. Previous versions of it had it where intellectual property wasn't as innately incorporated into it. Now, if I ask it with its latest version to generate an image of Pikachu doing a 720 on a skateboard, it's going to show me Pikachu doing a skateboard trick. So obviously it's picking up some intellectual property, maybe some copyrights there that it didn't previously have. We need to be very intentional when working with these tools about what source data is being in there and what kind of output we get because of this. Correct. And these tools don't have the auditability built into it to say, what are you actually doing? And if it can't get that far, what is the process that it's going through? Partly because it is a black box where you put stuff in, get stuff out. But I don't think auditability, personal experience, I don't think auditability was placed in that development process. Do we have any questions from the chat?
I think so.
Yes. Any questions from the audience? Yes.
Thank you. Sorry. How long did it take you to complete your conference submission?
I think, well, until the scramble at the end, I would say probably about 30 minutes.
One mic.
And just
I know it gets me too. Good.
Do we have or do we plan to have our own private cloud instance of this? I mean, I'm sure there are researchers working on something,
But
So there is different version of private, right? I mean, I think that like with any technologies, it's about Georgia Tech working through the process of licensing basically tools. What I will say is that, you know, I was in discussion last night with the GT Legal and procurement just to get access to OpenAI through Azure, because there are some real issues, including responsible AI and how even vendors wants to make sure that we're not using the tools for nefarious purpose, like disinformation. So which now introduce some additional challenges of additional data processing and retention of prompt for 30 days. So very happy to talk with you offline and share, you know, so the new challenges we're going through. But then, you know, there is also what basically we do today with large language models. So using PACE and other models. Yeah.
I was actually online and posted something in the chat that I don't have here. And
Sorry.
I just want to make sure people are aware that using AI as a tool in research is something that we're very interested in. So I'm the Vice Provost for Graduate Education, and it's really an issue for graduate students. What can they use or what can't they use? And they're running into problems with it, you know, and problems with being able to publish their work later or things like that. So we developed a tool, a guidelines for the effective and responsible use of AI as in research, not research on AI, but using AI in your research projects.
Where is it published right now? Because, you know,
It's
we have
published on the our site, which is graduate and postdoctoral education. But I worked with lots of people across campus to add to the guidelines for these. And I'm going to add the comment you said about reviews. That reviews, because that was definitely, you can't do that. So I'll add that to the guidelines. But I've also shared it with the, the EVPR's office. And we just created, we just posted it. So I put the link in the
That's perfect. We definitely
chat.
want to add that because, you know, this has been also a challenge, which is to kind of, you know, as part of the communication change management, aggregate all of the emerging guidance, right, that are, you know, popping up for good reason. Thank you so much for bringing that up.
We're getting the signal that we're done. Yeah.
Thank you very much, y'all.
Worked out well. Thank you. Absolutely.